Hey everybody, welcome back to Cityscape Brewing. I'm Dennis Fields, and today we're talking off flavors. I'm going to talk about the 3 most common ways people get off flavors in their beer and how to prevent those from happening to yours. The worst thing that can happen is spending all that time, effort, and money on a delicious beer, and then you go to take your first sip and you realize it tastes like crap. So we're going to talk about how to prevent those, but first, grab a homebrew, hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back after this. All right, how many of you been over to a friend's house or a neighbor's house that does their own home brewing, and you take a sip of their beer and you're kind of like, it's got that homebrew taste. Does everybody know what I'm talking about? We've all been there. We've all probably brewed one of those beers too. So we're going to talk about the 3 most common off flavors and how to prevent those. These are super common. Most people will experience them at least once in their brewing career. And we're going to talk about ways to prevent those so you can make delicious beer more consistently. Number 1. So the first, and we've done a whole video on this one before, is temperature control. And so when your temperature of your fermentation is very high, it can produce esters, whether it's too cold or too hot, depending on the yeast strain that you've chosen for your beer. And in most cases, those off flavors are not good, okay? And so they'll produce things, different types of compounds and things that are gonna ruin your beer essentially. And so I kind of learned this in the summer and winter months when I used to live in Minnesota. In the winter months, I would brew in my basement. I didn't have a fermentation chamber at that time. And in the winter, I would make great beers. And then in the summer, my beers would be kind of so-so, and they'd have some off flavors, maybe some grassy flavors or something else that happened during the fermentation process. And it really dawned on me that it had to do with the temperature of my basement at the time. In the wintertime, it was a lot cooler, and I was making better beers. In the summertime, it wasn't as cool, and it allowed the temperature inside the fermenter to get too hot and get some esters going on inside of the beer and during the fermentation process. And so it's good to keep in mind that although your room temperature, everybody has their thermostat set for upper 60s, low 70s, and that might be in the range of your yeast. However, the temperature inside of your fermenter is actually higher than that. And so you're gonna have a few degrees. So although your room temperature might be at 60 to 68, 70 degrees, the temperature inside of your fermenter may be at closer to 80 or 85, depending on how much action's going on in there. That might be a little high, but either way, it may be too hot for the recommended temperature range for your yeast. And so keep that in mind, and I would really highly suggest creating a fermentation chamber. I have a video on how to do that, super quick. You can find a used freezer like the one behind me and convert one of those really quickly for just a few bucks. So what to do if you don't have a fermentation chamber? Number 1, if you want to do lagers, it's virtually impossible. Lagers need to ferment at somewhere between 46 and 58 degrees. That's 8 to 14 degrees Celsius. But if you don't have an option of doing a fermentation chamber, you can buy a yeast or do a beer style like a Saison or a wheat or Belgian ale that allows for higher fermentation temperatures. Or you can choose a yeast like Keveik Yeast that likes higher temperatures. In fact, they actually like such hot temperatures that sometimes you actually need to put them in warm water or even have a heat lamp on them in the fermentation chamber to get to those higher temperatures. And something like a Keveik Yeast actually has esters that make the beer better, fruitier, citrusy, that kind of thing. So Keveik Yeast is a great choice if you don't have a fermentation chamber. I also have a video dedicated to Keveik on my YouTube channel. Check that out. Regular ales like to ferment somewhere between 62 and 75 degrees. That sweet spot is usually right around 67, 68 degrees. And so that's the internal temperature in your carboy. That's about 17 to 24 Celsius. Wheat and Belgian ales can go anywhere from that 62 low range all the way up to about 85 degrees, depending on the yeast strain. So it's really important to look on your packet of your yeast and make sure you're within that ideal temperature range for that yeast.
Number 2.
Yeast stress. Okay, so that can happen in a couple different ways. You could have a older yeast packet, so there's always an expiration date on your yeast packet, and when you have older yeast, there's less viable cells in it, and therefore it's a lot less cells to do the job of brewing or fermenting your beer. And so the yeast gets stressed out, and when they do that, they create off flavors. It also happens if you pitch too little of yeast in a larger beer. So kind of a rule of thumb that a lot of people use is anything over like 1055 or 1.055 is a good indication that you might need to do a starter. And so a starter is a way for you to replicate the yeast before you pitch it in your beer, so you have a lot more cell count before, and it helps it do its job. I like to think of it as doing two things. It doesn't just multiply the cells, but it also like gives them a warm-up session, right? It's like a runner kind of going for a jog and stretching before he does his race, because they warm up their muscles and they're stretching and they're less likely to get a cramp and that kind of thing when they're running. Same kind of thing happens with the yeast. They kind of know what to do. They're kind of teaching it how to do its job. You're warming it up, and then when you do pitch it, it's kind of like, I know what I'm supposed to do, and I've got a lot of friends to help me, right? So I kind of recommend doing a starter for most beers, unless it's going to be a pretty light blonde ale or session or something like that isn't going to require a yeast starter. Or you're doing like a Keveik yeast, which actually wants to be a little stressed, so it produces those esters, in which case you can do a little under pitching depending on the yeast strain that you're using. But I do have a video on how to make a yeast starter. I would really recommend doing that for most beers that you make, especially ales and especially lagers. So lagers are brewed at colder temperatures, and therefore they need a lot of friends to help them because they're not as active during those colder temperatures. So check out that other video. I'm gonna have all these linked in the video description below, so you can go ahead and just click those and try those out.
Number 3.
The last thing, third thing, is diacetyl. And so this is probably one of the most common off flavors, and it's because I think a lot of people get a little eager with their brewing, right? They want to hurry it up as fast as they can. They're excited. They want to get it into a secondary or a keg. And a lot of times people take their beer off the yeast cake a little too soon. And by that I mean, maybe you just hit 7 days and it could have gone a couple of points more, as far as maybe it's ending at 1.012, and it could have gone down as low as 1.009 or 10. And that kind of creates a problem when you take it off because it hasn't quite finished doing its job. Diacetyl is a compound that presents itself when you take it off the yeast too early, because it's a normal part of the fermentation process. And during the fermentation process, diacetyl is created, and then as the yeast kind of finishes up your beer, it remetabolizes the diacetyl in your beer, and then it converts it to more of a flavorless compound, right? And so all beer has diacetyl until it doesn't, until the yeast does its job. So taking it off too early, or not doing a diacetyl rest, is a good way where once you take it off the yeast cake, there's really kind of no going back, right? And so keeping it on there, making sure that it's completely done with fermentation is super important. A diacetyl rest is essentially just raising the temperature of your beer. This is really common to do with lagers, but I would especially do it with most beers, right? Even ales that are in the upper 60s, you could raise to 70, 72 degrees, and then it helps warm up the beer a little bit. It gets those yeast cells a little bit more active, and then they help eat up all that other diacetyl that's left in there. As a lager, you're brewing at such low temperatures that you need to raise it to kind of get those yeast active again and kind of cleaning up the rest of their beer before you go into your lagering phase, where you're really going to drop it temperature wise and condition it for long term. So you want to make sure that there's no chance that there's diacetyl in there, because once you do that, then the yeast is not active. It's not going to take care of that diacetyl flavor. Diacetyl kind of presents itself as like a butterscotch or movie theater popcorn, as sometimes people refer to it. It's got like a slicker mouth feel, and it's really common, and that's probably one of the flavors that you have at like a friend's house that has that homebrew taste to it. Always make sure that your fermentation is 100% complete before you take your yeast and transfer it to a secondary, or your beer and transfer it to a secondary or keg it. All right, guys, those are the 3 most common off flavors that you can get in your beer. That's gonna wrap this video up. As always, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. It helps tremendously, helps me notify you when I put out new videos as well. If you have any questions, comments, please leave them in the video description below. And always, happy brewing and cheers.